Greetings from the beautiful city of Budapest. I'm here near sunset. You got the river Danube that flows downwards towards the Black Sea, actually enters the sea on the border between Romania and Ukraine, a town called Vilkova that I've filmed before. And I'm here in Budapest because I've relocated temporarily with the war in Ukraine. And a very interesting video that I want to go into today brings me back to my time studying at SAIS in the US, School of Advanced International Studies and International Relations, is from John Mearsheimer. It's a video that has 22 million views, and it's an international relations lecture. So that's pretty phenomenal. It reminds me a little bit of the virality of the videos from Jordan Peterson from a few years ago, something we don't normally associate with having general appeal. And it's a very interesting lecture, and I definitely encourage you to go watch the whole thing. It's over an hour, so I'm going to link it down below in the description. So in today's video, what I want to do is go into applying to what actually has happened here in Ukraine, because the video has been widely circulated, especially by those who are more, shall we say, friendly to Russia, right? So the pro-Putinists in general circulate this video. Look, the West, it's all the West's fault. So I'm going to go into it, but I don't want to make it a very geeky IR, international relations video, because that will probably lose almost everybody who watches it, and you can actually watch the whole thing yourself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to distill the arguments down to make them more understandable and actually deal a lot with the commentary and how John Mearsheimer has actually reacted in the last month since Russia invaded Ukraine again. It is actually, when I'm filming this, I'm running out of, I'm starting to forget the number of days this war has been going on. I think it's day 30 today. When I'm filming this, you'll probably see it in a couple of days' time. So let's get into it and break it down so that you can understand, is the West really at fault for the current war in Ukraine?
SAR Experience.
What they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that.
So the first thing to give you a little synopsis on is offensive neorealism. And John Mearsheimer is the doyen in that field. And basically what how the theory goes is that states are they're basically competitive and self-maximizing and confrontational, and that is actually ultimately how they survive and their propensity to use violence. In this anarchic system that is international relations, it's basically like the Wild West. And you have to contrast that with liberal institutionalism, which says that actually states are better off by cooperating together, and it's also a feasible system so that we can kind of get rid of these kind of imperialistic wars. Now, obviously in history, we can all say that like we had empires, right? So obviously John Mearsheimer's theory definitely applies historically, but does it apply in the 21st century? And definitely since the Second World War, we haven't had that level of imperialism. Now, I know US invaded Iraq, you call that imperialistic war as well. So that is something to bear in mind, that he is of the opinion that not because he thinks that countries like Ukraine are somehow shouldn't be allowed to exist ideologically, but just in reality, if you are near to a big power, then basically unless you become effectively a vassal of that power, then you're going to get gobbled up by the big power, right? So he will speak a lot about the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, which is a doctrine from the 19th century where the US basically said all the Western Hemisphere, so all the Americas, US is the only country allowed to put military in, right? So that's why you had, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Soviet Union was trying to put missiles that might threaten the US onto an island that was obviously very close, right? So there were two concepts from the 19th century. Now, should that apply, in the 21st century, that Ukraine can't basically be independent and do what it wants and join whatever alliance it wants? Well, that's what we're going to see how he reacts to now. That is more liberal institutionalism, that Ukraine has that right. And also, think about it, that really Russia is a regional power. I know it has nuclear weapons, but its economy is more or less about the size of Spain or Italy, around that kind of ballpark, and is right beside the European Union, which altogether obviously dwarfs Russia economically and probably also militarily, judging by what's happened in Ukraine in the first 30 days of the war. So is it really the big superpower that was? They're the kind of 2 points: whether Ukraine has a right to actually exist and do what it wants independent of Russia, and whether Russia itself is actually this big gorilla, as he likes to call it, and effectively like a superpower, at least a massive regional power, projecting into Eastern Europe and Central Europe, not necessarily the rest of the other regions that it borders. So Mearsheimer's main thesis about why this invasion by Russia of Ukraine is all the West faults rests on the following: that NATO's, North Atlantic Treaty Organization's, expansion post the end of the Cold War eastwards to take in countries like Poland, here in Hungary, for example, also the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then the possibility that they were going to admit countries further to the east, closer to Russia, like Ukraine, like Georgia, is a provocation to Russia. And it's interesting, there's an adage about NATO, is that it's a way to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out of Europe. So there is a little bit of truth in that, in the sense that Russia's strategic interests, are they threatened by the expansion of NATO to the east? Well, definitely the ability of Russia to project power further to the west is going to be limited because of that Article 5 guarantee that an attack on one of the NATO members is an attack on all. So Mearsheimer also points out that he believes that if Russia had been stronger in the late 90s, they would have prevented the admission of those Baltic states in particular, because they've been part of the Soviet Union. So that's Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. But they weren't in a position to do that. And that's, I mentioned in my video almost 3 months ago from Kharkiv that when I met with the former Estonian president, Lennart Meri, he told me that he foresaw a day in the future, and he told me this back in it's probably around early 2004, maybe it was late 2003, that one day Russia was going to be strong again and they would invade every part of the former Soviet Union that didn't do what it wants, right, tried to act independent, in other words, and was not in NATO. And that's the reason why he pushed so strongly to join NATO and actually have that eastwards expansion. So definitely it limits Russia's ability to project power. Now, is it actually, and that's a strategic interest as far as Mearsheimer is concerned. It's not really that Russia itself is going to be threatened by eastward expansion of NATO per se. Then Mearsheimer also points out that just because NATO believes that it's a defensive alliance purely doesn't mean that it mightn't be perceived by Russia as an offensive alliance. And there is evidence that NATO has been used for offensive purposes in the past. So definitely there's some truth in that. And the perception about is very important, of course, about how Russia is going to respond to what it perceives as a threat versus how maybe the West perceives itself as behaving. And so then Mearsheimer also criticizes that in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, NATO kind of promised that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. Now, they didn't give them an MAP, which is a Membership Action Plan, or MAP, which is a great acronym to have for what it is, because that's actually the first step in becoming a member of NATO. Now, but what they did write in the final text from the summit was that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO in the future. And that was enough, according to Mearsheimer, to provoke Russia to take action. And in 2008, later on, Russia invaded Georgia, and they invaded South Ossetia. There were two separate republics there, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and they actually went past that into the rest of Georgia. They did withdraw eventually, but that was the first sign that Russia was now going to take military action, which they hadn't taken when the Baltic states, for example, had been applying to join NATO previously, simply because they were too weak, according to Mearsheimer. And the final thing he points out is that by supporting both morally and politically, and also with funding in terms of promoting democracy in Ukraine, they have fostered both the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution. So they were in 2004 and 2014, which it prevented the first one in 2004, Viktor Yanukovych from becoming president. They had to have a third round of voting, which he lost then. He didn't become president. When he then later became president in 2010, he was removed by the Euromaidan revolution. And again, Mearsheimer says that is bad policy from the US, and also on the flip side is bad policy by the Ukrainians, he claims, because the US is giving them hope that they can join the West, and that's what's creating the pressures for these revolutions, when he thinks that's just provoking Russia to take action to prevent that. And then finally, and very interestingly, he claims there would be a very shrewd policy and strategy by the US to weaken Russia by doing all this, to encourage Russia to intervene militarily in Ukraine, to invade Ukraine. But he made this speech a few years ago, and he actually claims that Putin would never be that stupid, basically. He says he's way too smart to ever do that. But lo and behold, here we are in 2022, and that's exactly what he's done. But interestingly, that he presents it as a very clever strategy, because he thinks that by invading Ukraine, a full invasion, it basically will weaken Russia, because they get bogged down in a war probably equivalent to a European Afghanistan over the long term, and then they'll come out of that severely weakened, which would be in America's interest. So he's kind of blaming the West for the current war, but at the same time then kind of suggesting it's in the West's strategic interest to do it. So not really sure what to say about that. Is it or is it not? Well, it depends, I guess, how it all plays out, because of course if Russia is stopped in Ukraine and doesn't advance further into Europe, maybe threatening a NATO country, then you could say maybe, like I pointed out in a video where I was talking about, is the West cynical in Ukraine? Then maybe so. But next up, let's get into analyzing a little bit more what Mearsheimer claims in his video. So what are some issues with Mearsheimer's thesis and his analysis? Well, first of all, he assumes that if NATO had not expanded eastwards, that maybe if NATO didn't exist at all, then there would be no war in Ukraine. Now, definitely, how is that going to be the case then? If there's, we have to look at the purpose of what NATO provides. So it is ostensibly a defensive organization that protects its members by having a collective defense. So an attack on one is an attack on all the members so that they'll respond. And some of those members are big heavyweights like the US and the UK and France, and they have nuclear weapons and big militaries, right? So it's a way for, say, small countries to protect themselves, especially if they don't want to be in Russia's orbit. So a country like here in Hungary, where they did have the history of Soviet tanks rolling in when they tried to make domestic changes, obviously during the Cold War, you don't have to worry about that so much. And without NATO being there, or without NATO having expanded eastwards or giving any sort of aspiration to Ukraine in particular to join, would that have meant that Russia wouldn't invade it? Well, if Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons as a deterrent, if it doesn't have a massive military that would deter Russia, or it's not in some alliance like NATO that would deter them in principle from invading, and Ukraine still wants to be independent of Russia, then I don't see how we would have avoided a war between Russia and Ukraine, because Putin has made it clear that he considers, in his declaration of war speech 2 days before the invasion, that Ukraine is not allowed to be independent and its borders are legitimate. So we'd have just had a war anyways in that case. Now, what Mearsheimer has suggested in some of his video clips since that lecture is that basically, well, is the West false for even encouraging Ukraine to be democratic and independent of Russia. And in fact, Ukraine, if it were smart and clever, it would find a modus vivendi with Russia.
And my view is, yes, the Ukrainians have agency, but if they were smart, they'd divorce themselves from the United States and try to work out a modus vivendi with Russia.
But the problem is that the only modus vivendi that it seems that Putin would accept is basically being a vassal state, and that means not being independent. So yeah, that's the kind of harsh choice. So what you could argue on the flip side is that, in fact, the real issue is not that NATO expanded eastwards and gave this kind of moral support to countries in Central Europe and further eastwards. I mean, we'll have to have a debate whether Ukraine and Belarus are really Eastern Europe anymore, if they're Central Europe. But the real issue is maybe that they didn't expand eastwards quickly enough and far enough, that they just didn't bring in Ukraine and Georgia into NATO when they wanted it, and they stopped short in 2008 because behind the scenes Germany vetoed offering Georgia and Ukraine a MAP, an MAP, a Membership Action Plan, like George Bush, who was the US president, wanted to give them, apparently. So, you know, you can look at it both ways. The problem is that maybe they started not to want to provoke Russia into invading Georgia and Ukraine, but the reality is that once those countries want to be independent of Russia and you have a revanchist autocracy in Moscow, then war seems to be pretty inevitable. And that brings me to the next issue with Mearsheimer's analysis, is that he seems to correlate the ruling class in Russia's interests with the country's strategic interests. And definitely, if it's an autocratic revanchist state like it is at the moment, then clearly they're going to be aggressive and not accept that Ukraine wants to be independent of them. That's what Putin outlined in his speech. But imagine if Russia had stayed the course and become a liberal democracy, then liberal democracies, as a rule, don't go to war with each other. Now, they wouldn't have been happy, probably, with Ukraine's decision to be independent of them, of Russia. But if you think about it, would Ukraine have been so keen to become independent of Russia if it was a successful liberal democracy itself? Because the real driving force, as I outlined in that video 3 months ago now in Kharkiv, is the prospect of prosperity. That's what attracts Ukraine to joining, not just NATO. NATO is just a means to an end to join the European Union and have that promise of prosperity, whether it materializes or not. But here, as you see in beautiful Budapest, being part of the European Union doesn't seem so bad when you look at the economic development here. So Mearsheimer doesn't really distinguish between the kind of state that Russia's become. He is a big fan of 19th century mindset and leaders. He talks about the Monroe Doctrine being, as it was in the 19th century, a very fundamental core of US foreign policy. Manifest Destiny Monroe Doctrine basically means that the US wants to dominate all of the Western Hemisphere. It's its sphere of influence. He argues that Russia should be allowed to have its own version of the Monroe Doctrine because it is this huge behemoth in the east of Europe, pretty much like the US is in the Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere means the Americas, so North, Central, and South America. But there's one issue that's come to light in the last month of fighting, is that militarily, Russia doesn't appear to be that strong. And then begs the question, then why should it have a sphere of influence at all if it's in fact not that big gorilla that he's presented them to be? Now, it does have, of course, nuclear weapons. It have the propensity to cause a lot of destruction, which Mearsheimer does point out that basically Russia will either, well, his argument is that by being lured by the West into this war, which he thought they would avoid because Putin was so smart, that they'll end up wrecking Ukraine in the process because they have this huge propensity for destruction. And we're seeing a lot of that now, especially in Mariupol and Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv. And basically that's also not in Ukraine's interests or the Ukrainian people's interests. But you can't really get around this real core question that I've noticed when I talk to people who are more sympathetic towards Russia, should we say, more pro-Russian, pro-Putin. Maybe you don't say that overtly, but in reality that's what in this conflict it turns out to be. And it comes down to the central question: does Ukraine have a right to be independent of Russia if it so chooses? And Mearsheimer basically says no, it doesn't, because it's beside this gorilla, as he calls Russia, and that's just the way the world works, not because he wishes it to be so, but he thinks the smarter thing to do would just to become, in effect, a vassal state of Russia, because it would stop Russia wrecking the country. And a lot of people who criticize Zelensky and say, oh, it's all his fault that people are dying, his own people, it's because he doesn't effectively surrender and become a vassal state to Russia. And you know, most people who are on the side of Ukraine basically don't agree with that, from what I can see, having a lot of conversations over the last 6 weeks or so, and definitely since the beginning of the war, is that if you believe that Ukraine has a right to choose its own destiny, that is not manifest destiny of Russia in Eastern and Central Europe, then you're not going to agree with Mearsheimer's analysis, because at its core, you're probably going to go for the opposite of what he's contrasting himself to, or his philosophy to, which is offensive neorealism. You're probably going to be more on the side of liberal institutionalism as a result. So I really think that's the core issue, and if you believe that Ukraine has a right to choose its own path independently, then you're going to reject his main thesis, which is that it's the West's fault. Probably going to more blame the Russians, because this war would be over tomorrow if Russia just left and they stopped bombing and killing and attacking people. It's very clear who the aggressor is, and if you come to the conclusion you don't think that Ukraine has the right to be independence, you're probably someone who would say that, don't poke the bear. So Russia, you have these people who say, don't poke the Russian bear. Well, actually, the big Russian bear, it stuck its nose into a honey pot, expecting to get lots of delicious honey. That's Ukraine, and in fact, it stuck its nose into a hornet's nest, and it's gotten bitten pretty badly. So that's how I view that analogy. A lot of people like to use if they are more friendly towards Russia's point of view, or pro-Russian. That's my analysis of John Mearsheimer's very thought-provoking and interesting lecture. It's gotten this phenomenal number of views online, so it's definitely worth watching in its entirety if you're interested in the topic and analyzing what he says, and not just the headlines and the titles and the reaction videos to it. It's down below in the description. And yeah, as I said, life isn't so bad once you escape Russia's orbit at all. Get out of their sphere of influence. And actually, just up here, Zelensky, Ukrainian president, he gave a speech a couple of days ago to, I think it was the European Council, the Council of Ministers of the European Union, if I'm not mistaken, basically called out each country about their support for Ukraine, or not so much support. So he had his biggest criticism for this country, Hungary. It's about this memorial that President Zelensky cited when he was criticizing Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary. And it says here, to the memory of the victims shot in the Danube, it's the river just here, by Arrow Cross militiamen in 1944 and 1945. He has all these shoes here. They're left as a memorial. So that's where I'll end my video today. And let me know what you think of John Mearsheimer's thesis and my reaction to it. See you in the next video. Do побачення. До свидания. Ciao, ciao from beautiful Budapest in Hungary.
SAR Experience.